Thank you, JT. And that's on behalf of the transition team here. And so thankful for the work that they have been doing. They've been meeting so often, and a lot of work that they're doing he didn't even have time to mention. But I will say, man, with the worship team, Taika plans this like months in advance. I have to keep on track to get her the information. But it's a lot of thought and prayer goes into it. But we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 in our series on 1 Corinthians. You know, I heard about one man who took his wife and children to a very small zoo in a very small town. And he talked to the zookeeper, and he said, "This is really an amazing little zoo. But I noticed that you have a lion and a monkey in the same cage." He said, "That just seems kind of strange. How well do they get along?" And the zookeeper said, "Well, they get along pretty well most of the time. But every now and then they have a disagreement and we have to get a new monkey." Basically, they get along until the lion starts acting like a lion and it reverts back to its true nature. That happens in churches too. In large churches and in small churches. That there comes a time where we get along really well. But sometimes we start to revert back to our old sinful nature, like that lion in the zoo. And it's amazing how it seems easy for Christians to sometimes forget that love is supposed to be the most distinguishing, obvious trademark of Jesus living in us. Jesus said in John 13:34, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another." But there is a command in the Old Testament to love others. So why did he say this is a new commandment? Well, you know, in the Old Covenant it does say, love your neighbor as yourself. But it never says, love your neighbor as I have loved you. That is how it was a new command. Jesus said, you love one another just as I have loved you. That is how it is a new command. Jesus' way of self-sacrificing love was revolutionary. And we've been in 1 Corinthians for several months now, but in chapters 11 through 14, he was talking to them, describing what things are supposed to be like when the church comes together for worship. And we know this because in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, he used the phrase, when you come together, 5 times. So he's talking about the gathering of the church. And he spoke about proper protocol when people are leading in prayer and in prophecy in chapter 11, and he also spoke about the Lord's Supper. In chapter 12, he spent a lot of time talking about spiritual gifts, which we looked at last Sunday. And he had to teach on this as there was a lot of division in the church. That was the main problem facing the church in Corinth, was their division. They had pride over so many things. He had to talk about spiritual gifts because their pride over which gifts were most important was dividing the church. And it all culminated then into this, what we call the love chapter, in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. So this is a very popular chapter from the Bible. And so often it's read in weddings. But more often than not, this chapter is thought of and understood apart from its context in 1 Corinthians that falls right into that section on chapters 11 through 14, which is about worship. And so as we go through this, we need to keep in mind that Paul didn't just reach a point where he thought, you know what, I'm feeling kind of poetic. I'm going to just take a break from what I'm doing and write about love. That's not what happened. He wrote about it because it was central to what he was getting across. The Holy Spirit led Paul to write this because this church was eaten up with division because they had puffed themselves up. Back in chapter 8, Paul said that they possessed knowledge. He didn't argue that. He said, you have knowledge. But then he said, this knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. What led to their disunity wasn't a lack of knowledge. It was a lack of love for one another. In chapter 11, he said that their lack of love for one another is what led to them making a mess of communion and the Lord's Supper. In chapter 12, their lack of love was what divided them over their gifts. So he ended chapter 12 saying, and I will show you a still more excellent way. And that is what leads to what we call the love chapter in 1 Corinthians 13. And I believe what God is saying to us through this chapter is this: love others God's way instead of the world's way. And to do this, we first of all have to have wisdom to recognize counterfeit love. It's important as Christians to remember that God's definition of love is different from what we find in the world. His definition of love, God's love, is infinitely superior to the counterfeit love that we see at work in our world. The world's version of love is typically conditional and is typically caught up in feelings and things that are associated with physical things and associated with lust. Now, I wouldn't say that it's always that way. I believe that there are non-Christian people who have some idea of the love of God in their life. I know non-Christian people who love unconditionally. They have experiences of that, and they experience it maybe with regard to their spouse or to their children. So they understand that. It's not totally foreign to them. They're created in God's image, so they have some awareness of it. And I've seen great love between husbands and wives who don't even know Jesus. Whether or not they realize it or not, they're loving one another with the love of God. So it's not totally foreign to them. But what I'm saying is that occasionally they experience that. But as Christians, this is the way we are supposed to love all the time. Even our enemies, Jesus said. You may remember that the city of Corinth was known for drunkenness and sexual immorality. And it was a city consumed with lust. And anyone looking for love in Corinth was looking for love in all the wrong places. And people in our world, everyone is searching for love. The problem is that the world has such a distorted view and version of love that's a cheap counterfeit to God's love. And we need the wisdom to recognize it. Sometimes it's obvious and doesn't require much wisdom. Back in June of 1967, some of you remember the Summer of Love. I was 6 at the time, so I don't have a huge recall of it, but I do remember, even at 6 years old, I was one who loved the Beatles. I loved hippies, and I thought they were cool, even at 6 years old. But, then they had their version of love. Then in 1968, the band The Doors had their song, Hello, I Love You. Remember the line? Hello, I love you, won't you tell me your name? Profound. If only Paul had known Jim Morrison. How pathetic. Hello, I love you, won't you tell me your name? That's the world's kind of love. So there are times where the world's definition of love is obvious and it's better called lust, and it's a horrible version of love. The city of Corinth had been given the status of a Roman colony by Julius Caesar in 44 BC. In 44 BC. And this was huge. To be given the status of a Roman colony meant that all of the citizens in Corinth and in places like Philippi and Ephesus, other Roman colonies, that they had all the rights and privileges of a Roman citizen, even if they'd never been to Rome. And it was a big deal back then. And it meant that you didn't even have to go. They made these places look like Rome in a lot of ways, to the point where you didn't have to go to Rome if you wanted to know what Rome was like. All you had to do was go to one of the colonies. Go to Corinth, you'll see Rome all around you. And the same with Philippi and Ephesus. And I think, when Paul said to the church in Philippi, our citizenship is in heaven. That's true for all Christians. Our citizenship is in heaven. And I think he's telling them, and he probably, I'm sure, told the church at Corinth this, that, just like if people want to know what Rome is like, all they have to do is go to Corinth. In the same way, if people want to know what the love of God in heaven is like, all they ought to have to do is visit our church. The world's love is counterfeit. If they want a taste of the love of God, they should see it here among us. Because our citizenship is in heaven. We are a colony of heaven on earth, or supposed to be. Now, those of you who are older like me probably also remember the goofy movie Love Story back in 1970. In that movie, there was what I believe to be the most lame line I've ever heard in a movie. It was said by the character played by Ally McGraw, whose name was Jenny in the movie, to her boyfriend, played by Ryan O'Neal. In the scene, he's running all over town, looking for her to apologize to her for something he said to her in anger. He finally finds her and says, "I'm sorry." And Ally says, "Don't. Love means never having to say you're sorry." So here's this guy, runs all over town, willing to do the thing that is one of the most difficult things for human beings to do, especially a guy, and say those words, "I'm sorry." And all she can say is, love means never having to say you're sorry. I would have responded, "Okay, I'm not sorry. I take it back." And then they double down on it, because later in the movie, when she dies of cancer, Ryan O'Neal's dad comes to him and says, "I'm sorry." And Ryan says, "Love means never having to say you're sorry." If I'm the dad, I'm thinking, what? What I'm saying is I'm sad that this girl that you love died. Stinking hippies. That was how the movie defined love. Never having to say you're sorry. And Jim Morrison, "Hello, I love you, won't you tell me your name?" You don't need a lot of wisdom sometimes to know the world's version of love is really messed up. Well, roughly 45 to 55 years later, after that movie, the people in modern America are saying love means never saying any lifestyle is wrong. That's love according to our world today. And not only that, it means you have to validate and celebrate any and every lifestyle. So, the world's love is a cheap counterfeit. Let's look at what God has to say about how we can love others in God's way. So first of all, even though we need wisdom to recognize counterfeit love, secondly, understand that love is essential. Look at verses 1 to 3. "If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing." The English language is pretty impoverished, and we have one word for different things where the ancient Greeks had several words to describe it, and that's the case with love. I say I love ice cream. I love pizza. I love Diet Coke. I love my wife, Cindy. But I promise you that what I feel for Cindy is far different from what I mean when I say I love Diet Coke. And probably even different from loving pizza and ice cream. But I'm stuck with the word love because like just doesn't cut it. If you've been a Christian very long, you're familiar with the different words for love in the Greek language at the time Paul was writing. And there were several different words. One was eros, that's that fiery, romantic kind of love, the physical passion. And it was about love on the physical level. And that would have been the most common word for love in a city like Corinth, which was obsessed with sexual immorality. Then there was the word storge, a heart-filled love between close family members, and it might even be the kind of love you would express for your pet. Then there was phileo, which was a brotherly love, and it's the kind of love involved in close friendships. But agape is the one Christians are most familiar with, and it's the one used here in 1 Corinthians 13 and so often throughout Scripture to define God's love for us and our love for one another. And it was an act of the will for the goodwill of others, and it was about selflessness and faithfulness and commitment and self-sacrifice. It's essentially the kind of love God has for us. And this word was actually very rare when Paul was writing this in the ancient world. It was a very rare word, only a couple of examples of it. Some even thought Paul had invented this word to describe the uniqueness of the love of God for us. But there were a couple of examples of it. Paul says that if he was able to speak, in verse 1, he says, if I was able to speak in these different languages, different human languages without ever having studied them, or in the language of tongue, in the tongues of angels, if I could speak in those tongues, if I didn't have agape, it would mean nothing. Many Christians who claim to practice speaking in tongues will say that Paul was describing a couple different forms of speaking in tongues. One was where you're speaking a language that is a human language that you've never studied, like we see in the book of Acts, chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost. And then there's another form of speaking in tongues that is the tongues of angels, and it's a private prayer language for people. And I disagree with this, but I don't make it a test of fellowship. But it's interesting that this gibberish or ecstatic speaking that many call speaking in tongues today wasn't uncommon in the pagan religions in Corinth and throughout the Roman Empire at that time. They had that form of gibberish speaking in tongues, but not the kind that we see on the day of Pentecost. But Paul says, if I was able to do that, it'd mean nothing if I'm not a loving person. And he goes on to say it's the same with prophecy and knowledge. All these things are optional, but love is not optional. That means that to be a Christian, you don't have to be able to speak in tongues. You don't have to be able to prophesy. You don't have to have great knowledge. But you do have to love this agape kind of love. That's required. You can't be a Christian and not love this way, according to Paul. In verse 2, he brought up that if any of us had prophetic powers to understand all mysteries and all knowledge and had all faith, even the kind that could move mountains, if we didn't have love, it'd be nothing. In verse 3, Paul said that there's no amount that we can give. If you were to give everything, we would admire somebody who sold everything they had and gave it all away to the poor. We would think, wow, what an amazing sacrifice. Paul says, if I did that, if I wasn't loving, in God's eyes, it's nothing to him. And he says, even if I delivered my body up to be burned, like if I gave my life for Christ, people might admire that, but God wouldn't if I was not a loving person. That's why it is essential. It's not optional. And then Paul says we got to put love in action. We got to put love in action. Verses 4-7. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. You know, the popular phrase, talk is cheap, has been around actually since the 1800s, but the phrase means that it's easier to talk about things than to actually do them. And it can be easier for Christians to come in together and talk about love, agape love, than it is to actually live it out. But I think the Apostle John said it best when it comes to all the talk about love. In 1 John 3:18, he said, "Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth." In other words, put love into action. Practice love in real life. To put love into action, we're supposed to look at how Jesus loved and then copy that. You remember the bracelets years ago, WWJD. What would Jesus do? And it was meant to tell us how we should respond in certain situations in our lives. Sometimes a better bracelet would have been if we'd had a bracelet that had the letters JWPNHGHITSITFP, which means Jesus would probably not have gotten himself into this situation in the first place. But in 1 Corinthians 13, we see Paul's description of what love is like, and it perfectly describes the love of Jesus toward us. So when we're dealing with unlikable people, if we want to put love in action, asking what would Jesus do would be an appropriate question. The perfect question. In these verses, Paul gave there are 7 positive expressions of love, and there are 9 verbs to show what love is not like. And you know the positive, that love is patient, it's kind, rejoices with the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Then there are the negative expressions of it, that it does not envy. You know, wanting something someone else has so bad that you kind of resent them for having it. Or boast. This is bragging about ourselves, trying to get others to envy us, like you see on Facebook sometimes. It's not arrogant or rude. If you're not sure what arrogant or rude is, just think of people who cut you off in traffic. Or people who, when you're in the line at Walmart, they are behind you, but they jump to the front of the line that just opened up. These are unloving people. Love does not insist on its own way. Love is not irritable. Some translations say it's not easily angered. Do you have a hair trigger temper? Do people have to walk on eggshells around you? If so, Paul would say you're not loving. Love is not resentful. Verse 5, some translations say it keeps no record of wrongs. Paul says that love does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. About 15 years ago, I ran into a guy who used to go to the church where I'd been preaching in Tennessee. And he left our church and went to another church. And when I saw him at a restaurant I was at, I asked him how he was doing. We caught up a little bit. And I asked him where he was going to church. And he said something like, "Oh, I'm going to this awesome church now. This church, they've got this most incredible worship service. And they've got this preacher. He just preaches what's so relevant." And I was trying really hard to bite my tongue and not say anything to show I was being easily angered. So I said, "That's great. So glad for you." When I saw him again, maybe a year later, I forget how long later, I wanted so bad to say, "So how's your nice, awesome church with its cool worship? And how is Mr. Relevance doing?" But I didn't say that because I'm not easily angered, and I've worked through it now. I don't keep any record of wrongs anymore. I'm very loving now, and it doesn't even bother me anymore. So I've grown up. You see, this list of positives and negatives are like a full-length mirror being held up to us. A couple of years ago, Cindy was watching our youngest daughter, Bethany's sweet girls, Sage and Thea. And at one point, Thea, who was 5 at the time, she's 7 now, but she went inside and she got into some chocolate. And Cindy has this an amazing sixth sense and can just tell when someone she loves has had sweets. It's amazing. This gift of hers works over a span of miles, hundreds of miles. She can just tell when somebody she loves is getting into candy or sweets and having fun. And here's an example. Cindy came inside and looked at Thea, and she had chocolate all over her mouth. And Cindy asked Thea, "Thea, did you get into the chocolate?" And Thea said, "No." And Cindy had Thea go into the restroom and look in the mirror. And Cindy said, "Thea, what do you see on your face?" And Thea said, "Nothing." And this passage is as if God is saying to us, are you as loving as you're supposed to be as Christians? And we say, yes. And the Lord holds up this mirror of what Paul says here. It says, what part of this definition of love are you lacking in? And we say, nothing. But this is a mirror that shows how unloving we can be. That's convicting. Let's move on. Verses 8 to 13. Value the permanence of love. Value the permanence of love. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three. But the greatest of these is love. You know, in verse 8, Paul pointed to the permanence of love when he said love never ends. And he pointed to these other things that they were so obsessed with, and he tried to contrast those things with the permanence of love. And he said, prophecy, it's going away. Speaking in tongues, they're going to stop. Knowledge, it's going away too. And the point is that God's kind of love is going to exist into eternity. In verses 9 and 10, he says, we know in part and we prophesy in part. That means right now we have a clue. I mean, we have some knowledge and we've given this gift of prophecy and we do okay with it. But it's partial and it's temporary. And then in verse 10, he said something that has led to much debate. He said, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. Okay, from verse 9, we know what the partial was. The partial was knowledge and prophecy. But then the perfect, those things will pass away when the perfect comes. So what is the perfect that will come and make knowledge and prophecy pass away? Some say it's when the New Testament was completed by the end of the first century. Others say it was when Jesus returns. Those things will go away. Others say the word isn't really perfect, but should be translated maturity, which it is translated in some places. So which one is it? I don't know. You can just go and have fun with that. But of this, I'm absolutely certain. Love is greater than knowledge. It's greater than prophecy. Love is greater than the ability to speak in various languages you haven't studied or that other kind that people claim. But it's greater than any spiritual gift. Love surpasses all of them. And verse 13 says, so now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. Jesus said in John 15:13, greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. God gives us opportunities every day to express the love of Jesus for other people. Fred Craddock, I'm going to close with this, but Fred said that back in the early 1960s, when he was studying at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, he was preparing for a comprehensive exam. And he said every night he would, after he'd studied for a long time, he would go to a diner near the school, near Vanderbilt in Nashville. He'd go there down this hill at about 11:30 every night after studying, sometimes at midnight, and he'd take a break from his studies. And he said I would usually get a grilled cheese sandwich and coffee. It was the routine for him. He said, in fact, it was such a routine that the guy behind the counter, when he saw Fred walk in, he'd immediately start making grilled cheese and pour his coffee for him. And then he said one night, the guy would always be very good about refilling it. He said the guy was very nice to him. But one night, there was a man who was there when Fred arrived. And Fred noticed the man hadn't been served yet. And Fred got his food, got his coffee, and even got a refill. And finally, the man behind the counter said to the man who was sitting at the counter, "What do you want?" And Fred said that this man was very elderly, he had gray hair, and he was a black man. The man said something softly, and the cook went to the grill, and he scooped up a hamburger patty from the back of the grill that looked like it had been burnt to a crisp. And he threw it on a piece of bread, no condiments, no napkins. And the cook gave it to the man. The man gave him some money and went outside and sat down on the curb and began to eat his sandwich. Fred said, I didn't say anything. I didn't reprimand or protest or witness to the cook at all. He said, and I didn't even go outside and sit beside the man on the curb. I didn't do anything. I was thinking about the questions coming up on my New Testament exam. And he said, I left the diner and I went back up the hill to my room to study. And then Fred said this. He said, and as I got up the hill, I could have sworn I heard a rooster crowing in the distance. He knew he had denied Jesus by keeping his mouth shut. Love always protects. God defined and demonstrated love for me and for you in the most perfect way in Christ Jesus and his death on the cross for our sins. And that kind of love is what is supposed to be characteristic of us as Christians. So let me ask you, what do you do with this? Because I'm asking myself, what do I do with this? Do we go away and think, well, we went to church today, sang some nice songs, heard a sermon on love, and how we're supposed to love others God's way instead of the world's way, so what's for lunch? Is that all we do with this? What are we going to do with this? Would you say you are becoming a more loving person, loving people in God's way now more than you did a year ago? Are you a more loving person now? It's a question I'm asking myself. Are you and I as loving as we're ever going to be? Or is this something we can grow in and become more loving God's way? Can we grow in this? Can we become more loving, or have we arrived? I believe we can. The Apostle John was a good example. He and his brother James, Jesus called them sons of thunder. One time in a Samaritan village, they asked him, you want us to call down fire from heaven and consume these people who aren't accepting you? And Jesus said, no. You guys, sons of thunder. But by the end of the first century, John wrote what is called 1 John. 2nd John and 3rd John and Revelation. But in 1st John, he wrote more about love in that book than any of the writers in the New Testament in one book. John had become known as the apostle of love. He had gone from being a son of thunder to the apostle of love. And I think he did it by reflecting over and over and over again on the love Jesus had for him. And I imagine he prayed, Lord, help me to love people the way you love them. And not a surfacey kind of love, superficial love, but love that is grounded also in truth. That they keep both of them together. We can grow in this. In fact, it's required. It's not optional. Let's do it and not just talk about it. Would you stand, please? We are going to sing a song of invitation. And there are many different ways God could be working on the hearts of people, either through message or songs or in countless ways throughout the week. And so if the Lord has been working on your heart in some way and you feel a need to give your life to Jesus for the first time and you want to know what it's like to be a Christian and to know Jesus personally, would you come forward and say, that's what I want in my life? And we would love to talk with you about that and set up a time to talk with you today and begin talking about that today. And maybe you've already done this, but you would say, you know what, I've not been a loving person. I've just kind of swept that under the carpet. And I want to repent of that. If that's you, we would invite you to come as well. I think there can be healing in that. Or if you're an immersed believer in Jesus, but you don't have a church home right now, you would like to serve him alongside of us, we would love to have you come forward and place your membership here. Whatever your decision is, you can make your decision right where you're at if you want, or you can come forward. Whatever's on your heart, we'll leave it up to you. But would you come while we sing?